Hello everyone, it's been a while and I thought I would do a book review. I have just finished The Rise of the Warrior Cop by Radley Balko. Radley Balko was a Cato for a long time, and he basically covered police militarization, police abuse, that sort of thing, the war on drugs. I think more recently he actually is working for the Huffington Post. But this book, it just came out maybe a month or two ago, and it's been making the rounds in the libertarian circuit, I'd say. Balko is definitely libertarian, but he doesn't write the book from that explicit perspective. The back of the book has some great praise. Arianna Huffington, I don't really think she's great, but she's a more moderate kind of Democrat person. But then you also have Ron Paul and Glenn Greenwald. And Glenn Greenwald is increasingly becoming pigeonholed as the one good liberal, the one liberal who actually takes civil liberties seriously. I know that there are other ones, but they are few and silent relative to him. And then of course you put Ron Paul on there, who's come from the completely opposite end of the political spectrum. Both of them give it very positive reviews. I remember listening to Radley Balko. He's interviewed by Scott Horton quite frequently. So anyone who goes and looks at Scott Horton's archives will see quite a few of these interviews with him. I haven't heard any since this book came out, although I would not be surprised if they did one. The subtitle on this book is The Militarization of America's Police Force. It's a good book. I'm not used to reading books that have text that's this large or this thick pages with lots of paragraphs, lots of chapter headings and stuff. So this book does not take very long to read. I'm used to much denser fare, which that's not. You feel better when you read a smaller book because you think you're making more progress when you're not really reading any more words per minute. But whatever, it's the same amount of information plus a psychological boost. So why the hell not? Other than it's bulky and it takes up way more space than this could be a really thin book if you had onion paper and whatnot. But the book is interesting. It goes through basically the history and the progression of the militarization of the police. It is largely related to, but not exclusively related to, the drug war. That's actually a parallel story, and he is careful not to get too tangled in his narrative to just make this a book about the war on drugs. It's not, although the war on drugs figures very prominently in this. The most interesting aspects I found in this book, other than all the historical quibs, and there are lots of things I didn't know that they talked about. Many of the events I knew had happened, but I didn't know the details. Some of the more recent ones I did, but he talks about the justifications for things like SWAT teams, and SWAT teams figure very heavily in this. SWATs are kind of like the nucleus change. Those are the first parts of the departments that were really changing, and then they became a nucleus that kind of metastasized and grew to infect entire departments. So you might originally start with just a single SWAT team, and before long the entire force is looking increasingly like that SWAT team. It's interesting that the things that SWAT is for, and he's very moderate. He doesn't say there's absolutely no reason that you could ever have heavily armed, heavily trained, body armor, helmet police forces. He goes, yeah, there are situations where that involves, and the very first use of a SWAT team was against the Black Panthers in Los Angeles. The first SWAT team, by the way, was in Los Angeles, the LAPD, and SWAT, the acronym now stands for Strategic Weapons and Tactics, but the guy who invented it wanted to call it Strategic Weapons Attack something, and his boss said, no way, we can't have something that says attack in the title, so he just changed it. But so he changed the acronym, but the meaning was completely unaffected. The Black Panthers, I don't think the raid against them was justified, but hypothetically it made sense in the idea that there's a large number of admittedly militant people, well armed. It makes sense that maybe you don't want to just send a beat cop there. And there are other events like the one that's cited most often. The events most often cited are the North Hollywood shootout, where we had two heavily armed gunmen, and then also school shootings. And in those situations, it's hypothetically conceivable that, a SWAT team makes sense. But there's something else going on, because those events, however much media attention they garner, are exceptionally rare. The chances that any particular school is the location of even a single homicide, let alone a mass school shooting, is something on the order of every 1,000 years they can expect that to happen. So any given school, it's going to be about 1,000 years, given the odds today, that they would have a school shooting of any type. The mass bank shootings where there's really heavy firepower utilized are extremely rare. It's something like 3 to 5% of all homicides involve rifles of any kind. Almost all the shotguns, a slightly higher percentage, and then the vast majority handguns, which, other than a very few very rare types, are not powerful relative to any other sidearm a police officer could carry. They're weak compared to rifles, at least ballistically. And only a small fraction of the rifles are even assault rifles or even military style ones. I mean, there's some that have military calibers, and that even those aren't assault rifles. So these events are extraordinarily rare. The other thing is, the job of being a cop is safe. It's getting safer and safer all the time. There isn't any escalation in violence. Violence in this society is trending down, and it has for 20 years. This is the great miracle that a few people, like Joe Biden, has taken credit for a few times. Probably Al Gore has too, but he takes credit for everything. I wouldn't be surprised if Barack Obama did also. But there's clearly something going on, and who knows? Alex Jones would probably say it's all the chemicals in our food that are turning the men into girls. Maybe that's part of it. But yeah, the pro-gun people are all going to say that it's because of the proliferation of guns, and while that's possible, I think it's not necessarily proven. It does, however, indicate that the proliferation of guns isn't causing crime. But he talks about the homicide rate of police is about double what it is for the entire country, which means it's less than most of the larger cities. And so it's actually less than someone who lives in, say, Boston. So you have a better chance of being murdered if you were just a regular Boston person than if you're a cop. Now, I think that's probably spread very unevenly. There are probably areas that it's more likely than not. Other areas where it never happens. And he cites, towns and stuff getting body armor, AR-15s, or actually fully automatic M16s and tanks, and literally in the entire history of the town, which could be over 120, 150 years, no police officer has ever even been shot, let alone died. So there becomes what's the point? But despite the decrease in violence, the decrease in officer deaths, SWAT teams and militarized police have grown not exponentially, but they've grown enormously more common. There's more and more and more. The number of towns that have them has increased, the number in each town has increased, and the militarization of each of the departments has increased, even if they don't specifically happen in the SWAT context. And the other interesting thing is these SWAT teams are not used in these hypothetical situations that supposedly justify them. They're used primarily to just serve warrants, not to stop a mass shooting or a bank robbery. They're used to serve warrants overwhelmingly against nonviolent criminals, and obviously mostly for the war on drugs. And these are things, when they started SWAT, they didn't say, well, this is so that we can serve warrants. They said, this is for the Black Panthers. This is for, the crazy gunman in the top of the bell tower. His name's escaping me. His name is something Whitman, at the University of Texas, which was an important event in all this kind of getting people more worried about crime generally. They didn't say we need all this funding so we can go and break down people's doors and shoot their dogs because they might have some pot. But that is actually what's happening. And the ironic thing is, when these mass school shootings in particular happen, SWAT usually does not intercede. The most famous example by far is Columbine, where you had a school shooting. SWAT actually got there relatively quickly, and they did not engage, and they were not allowed to engage. In fact, one of their officers apparently attempted to and was told, no, it's too dangerous. So it's funny how the government does this generally. You need us to protect you, you need us to protect you, you need us to protect you. The fact that we protect you justifies the fact that we're going to take as much of your income as we declare and to rule over you as absolute overlords. And then, if you actually need protected, the life of our officers come first, and we're not even going to try. And that's what happens most of the time. No school shootings have been stopped by police, at least directly. There is some debate. In the Adam Lanza case, some people think he committed suicide because he realized law enforcement was there. I mean, that remains to be proven, and even if it is, they sure waited a long time. I mean, I think it's quite ironic that it's come to that. He talks about the police unions and how interesting, they basically push laws that make it impossible for cops to receive any kind of punishment whatsoever. As it is right now, because of sovereign immunity, they can basically get away with anything. You can't sue them when they come and they break down your door, they kill you. Sometimes there are lawsuits and sometimes they win, but it's always against the municipality or the state or the government. It's never against the individuals, so they have no disincentive. It doesn't mean anything to them if there's bad press or there's some harm done. In the extremely unlikely event that there's actually a lawsuit that makes it to court and actually gets ruled against them, it won't be ruled against them personally, it will be ruled against the town or whoever else, their employer, the government, not them. So they have nothing to lose, really. So there's an enormous incentive problem there. Also, there's another element to this where men, this isn't specific to SWAT or military or government generally, but men like to bond, and they form little groups. And I think this has some evolutionary precedent in the hunter-gatherer kind of society where they're going to be a team to hunt the mammoth or whatever. And you see this when you watch football or when you watch other sports. Like men like to be together, to socialize in groups of mostly exclusively men. They like to be boys be boys. And he is describing a researcher who has been, that's not Balko, but it's somebody from, I think, a university in West Virginia or Virginia, who is he's totally appalled by the militarization of the police. It frightens him, he condemns it in no uncertain terms, and he's been researching it for years, and he knows the ins and outs of how bad this is all the way, and he got invited to go to it was supposedly something they were all getting paid for, some consulting kind of job training, and they all were just at a gun range shooting things that the rest of us can't really own, like fully automatic grenade launchers, that sort of thing. And while he was there, the guys who invited him, and these are people who he had studied basically, who thought he'd have a good time, they asked if he'd like to fire, and they gave him an MP5, and he tried to use it, and he'd never used a fully automatic weapon before, and so he kind of didn't handle it all that well, which nobody would in those circumstances. And of course they started chirping him and making fun of him, and he felt, even from a very objective position of not appreciating this entire scenario, he felt like his manliness was being challenged, and he said, well, I've never used fully automatic weapons. I grew up with shotguns. I know how to use shotguns. And they produced a shotgun, and then he went, he did a demonstration, supposedly, according to the report here, convincing enough in his skill, and they all applauded him. And he said he felt great, and he felt like, the amount of bonding that took place in a situation where he are going into it assumed these guys are part of the problem with society was incredible. And see, the thing is, most of the people who join don't have that perspective. In fact, most of the people who join like that aspect. Not only that, they have a will to power, a sadomasochistic desire to bully and to kick ass and to be a tough guy. And this stuff exists without the government. So this is a phenomenon that is a problem no matter what society we have in. But if you create an institution and then you say if you are a member of this institution, the potential for negative consequences for your action is either eliminated, and it's not totally eliminated, but largely eliminated, mostly reduced in some way, you are asking for the worst kind of moral hazard you can imagine. They actually talk about this a little bit more. When the LAPD started it, obviously, the LAPD had thousands of officers in it. And they said, well, we don't we want this to be an elite team. And I'm not, the LAPD can fucking go to hell, but this is the way they are kind of looking at it, and this sort of makes sense in a rational kind of way. Is the people who really want to do this are probably the people that shouldn't do it. So they would get all the applicants and they're like, look, this person's very eager to do this. That's a prima facie evidence that they're a power-hungry maniac, and so maybe they shouldn't be allowed to do it. Also, since this is going to be something that's, pretty, it's supposed to be an elite team, they're selecting the people who not only don't show any outwardly sadistic signs, they also are selecting for people who have a lot of skill. And if you have a large police department and you're having 1 or 2 SWAT teams or whatever, or just 1%, then that's possible. But now we're getting SWAT teams in towns that have 20 officers. They don't have a big pool to select from. They certainly can't turn down the people who are interested, because those are the only people interested. There are other interesting things that I hadn't thought about, like the clear, how the funds made available to SWAT teams. And look, the growth of SWAT teams is incentivized by the federal government. The federal government basically goes and says, we will give you all, and I forget the name, they're called Byrne grants, BYRNE, something like that. Byrne grants were basically, okay, we'll give you money, and they give it based on how many drug arrests you make. So if you're going around catching rapists and murderers, you don't get any. If you go around catching pot dealers, or not even pot dealers, pot users, you get more. So there's a huge incentive. Now there's other incentives like forfeiture, where they basically can take the property of anyone they suspect of being a drug dealer, which also is basically funding these departments. There was an interesting part where he was talking about a woman police officer who her whole dream was to stop child predators. She didn't like children getting abused, and so obviously she joined the police, and she could not get funding for what she was trying to do. She was out there trying to actually stop child molesters, child rapists, child abuse generally. It was just her and just her own efforts, and the city was like, look, sorry. And at the same time, you've got the SWAT team going around, busting skulls, breaking down doors for pot, and they're driving around in Humvees with 50 caliber machine guns, Kevlar, just literally millions of dollars to go around like, well, what's worse, child rapists or pot smokers? Or what's worse, murderers and arsonists and rapists, or pot smokers, or people, it clearly makes no sense, but that's where all the funding is. And also, it's interesting, the size of these Byrne grants, and there have been others, under Clinton they called it community policing, but all that meant is we're giving money to police departments in the communities, but again, the money is tied to arrests for drug interdiction, so again, incentivizing that. But Obama has doubled these Byrne grants. They kind of went down during Bush. Not that there wasn't militarization going on, but the Byrne grants themselves kind of were pared down. The Recovery Reinvestment Act basically doubled all of them. In 2011 was the biggest year ever. In fact, it was something like twice or 3 times. No, it was more than that. It was 18% of all the total. And this is a 40-year program. So, in 2011 they were supposed to, but he doesn't know when he wrote this, I haven't checked, but it's even more in 2012, and it's just ridiculous, the stuff there's a whole office to give them to facilitate the transfer of Pentagon equipment and personnel, or not personnel, but Pentagon equipment, and a lot of it's innocuous, like a lot of it's office furniture, copy machines, or plunger, stuff like that that's useful but not necessarily militaristic. But then it's also tanks and helicopters, drones, of course M16s, and all. And then he talks about how these towns get these Bearcats, and then what do they do with them? Is they're in the parade, and then at the Union picnic they set it up next to the inflated bouncy area for the kids. Which, okay, that's better than them using it to kill people, I admit. Part of my solace in all of this is that the government is so wasteful that the vast majority of this equipment won't be used for anything. I mean, they're giving bayonets out, fucking nets. And you have to ask yourself, these municipalities and sheriffs and city cop leaders who are going through like the list. Why do they order bayonets? Why do they order this stuff? Like what? And it's clearly because they can, because they're getting it's free for them. It's not free for the rest of us. We have to pay for it. This stuff should be sold at auction to the American people, quite honestly. It should never have existed in the first place. That's assuming that it was taxed or whatever, but different. That would be better than just giving it to the police departments. What else? Okay, he talks about, again, the unions who want what they call police law enforcement's Bill of Rights, which basically means they can't do anything. They can't be convicted of anything. They can't do any wrongdoing. And he talks about at the end, like, okay, we should get rid of the war on drugs. But we're getting to the point now where they're just using it for everything. I mean, it's not just the war on drugs. All these regulatory agencies, like the FDA is using them to bust down people who are selling raw milk. You got the ATF using them for guns. All these agencies, they want this. They want power. They like having it. And because of the incentives involved, there's nothing wrong. If you or I just said, like, I like power, I work out all the time and I have roid rage. Okay, we could do that, and after a couple days or even just one day, we would be dead. And not necessarily because of the government, because of the people around us would, realize that we were a threat and neutralize us. And in the United States, that often entails getting killed. Not often. It can entail getting killed. These guys don't have to worry about that. And it's interesting too. They act all macho when they know they're raiding in the middle of the night some grandma's house. They know they're not going to have to fight. When they think they actually are going to have danger, if they think they're actually going to encounter somebody who's going to fight back, then they don't do it. They're fucking cowards. Most of them. The vast majority. He talks about the mentality of these guys. They want to kill, they want to bust ass, and they can do whatever they want. Oh, he talks about the thin blue line, which I've heard before, where officers are sometimes legally required not to incriminate other officers. So if an officer sees other officers doing something wrong, and then he tells, it's like, oh, he's a whistleblower. And like the unions hate, even the union, like the unions who will do anything, who say that you should literally get away with murder. Literally get away with murder. But then if you tell and you say, oh, that guy is bad, that cop did a bad thing, then they hate you and they get you out of the department. And he has a letter where a union guy was writing to the police, like, I'm so sorry, one of our members went to court and told the truth about a crime committed by the other employee. That's and how they can be so delusionally evil, where they can write stuff like that and not think for even a second, oh yeah, maybe this is bad. Like, these people are so far gone. I'm sure some of them have consciences and they develop, and that's the thing, is if you have a conscience and you do the right thing, you get driven out or you drive yourself out because you realize how much bullshit it is. And that's left with everybody who likes to beat skulls. He talks about they don't even keep statistics on how many people are shot and or killed by police. They don't report it, and there have been attempts where people have got. He talks about a guy in Maryland who was the mayor of some small town. His house got busted in. They killed his dogs. Obviously wrecked everything. The reason they did it is because earlier another cop had placed a box with marijuana on his front porch, and then the fact that he then he thought he was getting mail for his guardian equipment or whatever. He hadn't even opened the box. They break in. They kill both of his dogs. Shoot them in the back. One of them, this is fucking sick. Like, one of them actually went to the dog who was just trying to be petted. It was distracting it, just, oh, hi, welcome to our house. And then the other one came and shot it in the head at point blank. And that is interesting. Look, for some reason, the dog thing really resonates. He said one of his co-workers this is interesting. One of his co-workers at Cato lectures about Waco, Texas all the time. And when he gives lectures about it, people are like, well, maybe they shouldn't have burned it down, but the Branch Davidians were kind of crazy, and they did have a lot of weird ideas, and they had a lot of guns, although they had the same guns per capita as the rest of Texas, but whatever. But then when he tells them that the ATF murdered all the dogs, or killed all the dogs, I guess murder's the wrong word, shot and killed all the dogs, and you can see the pictures of the dead dogs, that's when people get upset. And so Balko actually started a website called Puppy Side, which records all the all the killings of canines and probably other animals as well by police, and that actually gets people. I wonder where PETA is on this, by the way. I've never heard PETA actually, like, you know, they get mad at people eating farm food, and then the cops go around shooting wrecks, you know, in the back. I mean, we have them killing chihuahuas, you know, golden retrievers. I mean, it's so much. Yeah, out of the millions of times people encounter dogs, it's possible there are attacks. But, you know, he compares it to the post office. He's like, well, you know, every post office worker is given instructions on how to deal with a dog, how to tell if a dog's actually attacking you. And, you know, we have literally millions of postal workers encountering millions of dogs every day. And the number of incidents is tiny, and the number of attacks, it's like 1-2 per year. And so, yeah, the cops are killing them dozens, hundreds of times a week, maybe. And every time they just say, well, it was going to attack me. Well, that doesn't make any sense. I'm sorry. That's complete, utter bullshit. That's all they have to say is, you know, I thought it was going to attack me, and then they shoot the chihuahua in the head or the golden retriever in the head. Anyway, totally a tangent, but an interesting point nonetheless. And it's very interesting how people respond so much better. I think it's because people just assume that dogs are noble creatures that are innocent, where they realize people are not necessarily so. Although children tend to get that too, and the Branch Davidians had a lot of children who were killed, but that's a different story. Yeah, people. So this mayor, he basically wanted to introduce legislation in Maryland. This was in Maryland, and the only thing the registration would do is would have the SWAT teams record how many rounds of ammunition they fire in raids. It doesn't say admit your guilt. It just says record. Have some kind of record of these events, some kind of bureaucratic tape measures so we can see, you know. And they didn't even want that. They don't want that. They don't record how many people they shoot. They don't record how many dogs they shoot. In terms of fixing property, it's very willy-nilly. Sometimes they do it. I guess in New York they offer instructions on what locksmiths to call, so obviously they assume they're breaking lots of doors. But this is very, you know, most of the time they come in, they ransack everything, and then they leave, and they just like, fuck you, you know, if they don't arrest you, even though they just like assaulted you, basically destroyed your property, and then you don't get anything in return. Now eventually maybe you can sue and maybe get something, but it's very hard. But it is so evident in this that the perverse incentives involved. Like, this is such a rigged game. They talk about, and people talk about checks and balances. Grow up, fucking people. If you believe in checks and balances, because, you know, when they put these like no-knock raids, no-knock was a controversial thing in the 70s. Like, whoa, the castle doctrine, you should have to ask to come into someone's home. You have to give them the chance to let you in. You know, you should try and arrest somebody when they're not at home. But they said, well, it's all right because we'll have judges will look over the warrants, and if it's not a good warrant, if there's not evidence that it's really there, the judge won't allow it. And that is like, that maybe sounds plausible, but in empirical fact, it's bullshit, because there are judges who will go 20 years and never turn down a single warrant. And he goes through some of the warrants, like they have the only evidence being from an informant who has never been correct, who has informed against hundreds of people and never come up with anything, and that's the only evidence. Or a cop saying, it makes sense to me to think that, you know, or like circular reasoning, like the fact that I'm seeking a warrant indicates the presence of evidence that justifies a warrant. Like literally that. And the judge is like, oh yeah. And then he talks about, you know, researchers have looked at the judges and say, okay, what's your criteria? How are you even deciding this? You know, and they confront them and be like, well, what about this case? I mean, you approved a warrant, a no-knock warrant for an 80-year-old couple, you know, and the judge will be like, look, we're busy, we don't have time to read all these things, so we just sign our name out. What's the big deal? Who cares? Like, okay, well, except when you sign your name, then an 8-man team, a fully armed goon squad, breaks into a house in the middle of the night, kills the animals, holds the family at gunpoint, destroys all their property, gives them heart attacks. People die from heart attacks from this. Burn their house down with their flashbang grenades, and you don't have the time. You can't take the time to read the document before you fucking sign it. And he did, and it's to him. It's like, well, of course I don't. Like, what's the big deal? I'm just ruining people's life with my signature. This is supposed to be the oversight. This is supposed to be the check and balance, independent judiciary that's making everything right. Same thing with the prosecutors. They rubber stamp They're all in the same fucking group. I don't know how people can... You can't have the same institution be a check on itself. I'm sorry. Like, there's no... Have the watchman appoint his own watcher, which is what government is doing. And people find that to be, like, convincing in some sense. And then they take the evidence of the cop over everybody else, even though we know that they're encouraged to lie. They're even obligated to lie in some cases. Everything else gets discounted, so they win in court every time. Thankfully, like with the proliferation of recording devices, this is becoming something that is harder for them to do. And again, some people are mad and say, hey, police should have to have these recording devices, and they resist. But why would you resist? Like, if everything you do is okay, then there's nothing wrong with having a recording. The only reason you can object to having a recording is because you think you're going to do something that is guilt-worthy, that is criminal, and yet they resist it every time. It's the arguments that cops make, and police and prosecutors and government generally to defend themselves, all imply gross criminal aggressive behavior, all of them, and they make them all the time. So the whole I think the idea though that like it's just the war on drugs. Look, whenever you have an institution that can coach itself, then you're going to get this sooner or later, eventually. I mean, we could say, okay, yeah, let's all be equal, blah blah blah. But then, whenever there's a dispute, I get to be the arbiter, even if I'm the arbiter in my own disputes. Okay, I'm a great guy. I'm not going to take advantage of that right away, but eventually I'm going to rule against somebody, and it won't be long before I realize I can just do anything. And as long as people adhere to the rules, the rule of law, quote unquote, I'll be fine. Now, if I am so overt in my depredations that people just rebel openly and forget about the rule of law, okay, so there is a check. It's wrong to say there's no checks. There's fucking checks, because if there weren't, we'd all things would be a lot different. But there's no legal check, and there's this high bar that has to be raised before there's any disincentive for them, and before we reach that margin, like, thousands of people die and millions of people are aggressed against and ruined and impoverished, and that's a shitty system. So, interesting book, good quick read. All the horror stories in there. That's the kind of anecdotal stuff that people listen to, but then he combines that with empirical data. Look, police don't need this kind of protection. They don't need this kind of deference. They don't have the most dangerous job in the world. They get paid the same if they go to the donuts or if they stop the Klebold's and Harris's of the world, which they don't. They don't intercede. This is the big Hollywood myth that, we need them to protect us. They don't protect you. At best, they might maybe look into who harmed you. And there's a good chance they won't find them, and even if they do find somebody, it's the wrong person. And that's all very provisional. That's only certain crimes. If you get robbed, they don't give a shit. They will not lift a finger to find your car if it gets stolen. They'll take the time to file a report, and that's it. And then they're too busy. They're too busy playing machismo kids games, dressed up in costumes, actually ruining people's lives, risking their lives, and sometimes even taking them. There are some hopeful signs because of the polarization, because the stuff actually gets recorded now. That's not necessarily to say things are worse now, and we're just documenting the increase. It's more of we didn't really have the evidence beforehand, because the cop would say nothing bad happened, and that would be that. It would have his word against somebody who would be an alleged drug dealer or whatever. Can't trust them. He talks a lot about the rhetoric of the use of the term, the war on drugs, that sort of thing. The amping up. The use of that rhetoric stems primarily, not exclusively, but primarily from President Nixon trying to campaign on that issue, making a in the 60s there was this big idea, there's this counterculture, there's this growing segment of society that's threatening in some sense, and Nixon said, I can get elected if I'm the guy who takes the hard line against that, which was true. He did get elected, among other reasons, for that. And he made it an issue. This is a clear example of them making something an issue in order to get political points. But then they start subsidizing it, they start paying for it, and it gets a life of its own. You know, institutions grow and they survive, and you start an institution, this job is to aggress against people for you know, non-violent crimes, and it's going to want to perpetuate itself as much as possible. So anyway, good book, and I highly recommend it.